Pope Francis began his general audience with a humorous reflection on the topic of his catechesis, namely the communion of saints.
Tante volte noi diciamo nel credo nella comunione dei santi, ma se si domanda cosa è la comunione dei santi, io ricordo che da bambino rispondevo subito, i santi fanno la comunione.
He explained that the communion of saints means being able to ask the saints who are in heaven to intercede and ask God for help. He said it's important to understand that God is the one who performs the miracle, not the saint who is a mediator.
Non è una cosa magica, non è una superstizione la devozione ai santi, è semplicemente parlare con un fratello, una sorella che è davanti a Dio, che ha percorso una vita giusta, una vita santa, una vita di modello e adesso è davanti a Dio. E io parlo con questo fratello, con questa sorella e gli chiedo la sua intercessione per i bisogni che io ho.
At the end of his weekly catechesis, a person in the audience started yelling, but the Pope's microphone made it difficult to hear.
Glorioso Patriarca San Giuseppe, il cui mio amato padre.
Nevertheless, the Pope did not ignore what happened and interrupted his speech.
Io vorrei finire pregando per lui, il nostro fratello che soffre, poveretto, se sgridava è perché soffre, ha qualche bisogno, non essere sordi al bisogno di questo fratello. Preghiamo insieme la Madonna per lui.
The man had shouted against the use of face masks and directed some insults at the Pope and the Church. As he has done throughout this catechetical series, the Pope concluded with a prayer to St. Joseph. Pope Francis also shared a personal fact. He said that he has said this prayer every day for more than 40 years.
Glorioso Patriarca San Giuseppe, il cui potere sa rendere possibili le cose impossibili.
Organisers had billed this second weekend of the blockade around the Canadian Parliament as a family day. It's clear there's an awareness of the negative headlines of last weekend, when protesters were accused of attacking those wearing masks and displaying racist symbols. The blockade began as a protest about cross-border trucking vaccine mandates, even though 90% of cross-border truckers are vaccinated, and the US insists on vaccination too. But clearly it's now about pandemic policy in general.
We are fed up with these restrictions since 2 years. Everywhere, lockdown, curfew. You know what I mean.
And those who joined the protesters on Saturday also raised a range of issues. The protest organisers, who are from the extreme right wing of Canadian politics, are demanding the overthrow of the government. But there were also anti-vaxxers, religious fundamentalists, and those raising topics of concern to both the right and left, like the power of pharmaceutical companies or the civil liberties implications of mandates. And then there were those who'd simply had enough of the pandemic.
Everything has been lockdown, in person, lockdown again, spending like days and weeks in my bedroom and then going all the way back to school and still feeling isolated.
The polls do show a majority of Canadians are fed up with the handling of the pandemic by both federal and provincial authorities. But they also show overwhelming support for mandates and public health measures designed to ease the strain on the healthcare system. And that makes the organisers' ultimatum that they won't budge unless all mandates are removed challenging. It is difficult to see how this will end. We've covered protests in Canada in the past, either for Indigenous rights or against pipelines, and the authorities have cracked down swiftly. But these trucks aren't going to be moved so easily. Shia Bertazzi, Al Jazeera, Ottawa.
Vaccinations are in full swing at Austria's biggest vaccination center in Vienna, but around 20% of the population has so far refused to be jabbed, and now the government wants to force them. A broad majority in parliament has passed a new law.
In Austria, we make a clear evaluation, but if the healthcare system is in danger, for you, for me, for all of us in the country, then this counts for more than personal rights.
Tens of thousands of Austrians have demonstrated every weekend against COVID restrictions and compulsory vaccinations. Michael Brunner founded a party with the sole purpose of fighting the government's COVID policies. He doesn't believe scientists when they say that vaccines are safe.
Compulsory vaccination is not based on evidence, and there is no way to justify it in legal terms. It's a serious violation of fundamental rights, and right now there is no justification for violating them.
He predicts thousands of lawsuits will be filed against this law and expects it will never be enforced. Austria is going to great lengths to increase its vaccination rate, handing out free donuts after a first jab and having these special ones to celebrate boosters. But the government is going much further by having vaccinations compulsory, a move that some fear will be counterproductive.
It's risky because you risk losing the people in the middle, the people who might have concerns, they might have hesitations, but they're not anti-vaxxers. So this is a known effect that when a compulsory policy comes in, especially when it's concerned something as important and invasive as a vaccination, then people tend to think, okay, if I'm being forced to do this, there must be something wrong with it, or I'm not going to do it just because I have to.
Austria had mandatory vaccinations before, when children had to be inoculated against smallpox until the 1980s. Now the country will be the first in Europe to do the same for COVID vaccinations, seeing if substantial fines will work, where gentle persuasion has failed. Stepfassen, Al Jazeera, Vienna.
In a poor neighborhood in the Ecuadorian capital, Quito, rescue workers search for bodies in the mud. 17 hours of continuous torrential rain overwhelmed a nearby reservoir on Monday, sending a wall of water, mud and rocks through this residential area. Franz Hernandez is a migrant from Venezuela who works in Quito. He was badly injured and his home was destroyed.
We were so scared. We were in the living room and we tried to leave the house, but it was too late. A wave of flood water burst through the front door. It was so powerful it broke the door in two.
Oh my God!
This footage was filmed by a woman living there. It shows a kilometre-long deluge of muddy water sweeping down her street. Dozens of people were killed and injured. Authorities say the area is still unsafe.
Many things can still happen at the top side of the mountain. Landslides can still happen. We're continuing to monitor the situation with drones to provide residents with a sense of safety and calm.
The mayor has set up shelters for families forced to leave their homes. But many say the disaster could have been prevented if the ravines bordering their neighborhoods had been properly maintained.
This is not new. It has been going on for a long time. We've sent many letters to the municipality warning them about the danger of the ravine. This tragedy was anticipated.
Many say they feared they wouldn't survive the mudslide. Now those with the least will have to rebuild what little they had to start with. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
These are the remains of neighborhoods in the Bolivian city of La Paz, devastated by heavy rain that brought floods and landslides. Local people are taking stock of the damage. This woman and her family lost their home after it was submerged by mud.
The day before yesterday, rains were heavy and the water came down like a river with great force coming from everywhere. We got scared because we haven't been able to sleep for 2 nights. Last night it also rained and we stayed up until 1 in the morning watching over the house.
Tens of thousands of people have lost homes and property. Many haven't slept for several nights, as dark clouds overhead raise fears that more rain could come at any time.
All the weight of the mud was coming into my yard. Since the mud comes from above, it comes down with strength, and when it rains, it becomes worse. We practically don't sleep anymore.
Local authorities are clearing debris. Some houses are beyond salvaging and will have to be torn down. Many are blaming the heavy rainfall on a weather phenomenon linked to extreme weather events.
Es que en este periodo estamos sufriendo por el fenómeno de la Niña.
At the moment, we're suffering due to the La Niña phenomenon. It's conditioning weather events, and they're being characterized mainly by very short events with an extremely high intensity that almost doubles the rainfall that was recorded in other seasons.
Many parts of Bolivia are on orange alert, meaning more landslides and rains are expected in the days and weeks ahead. Vincent Monaghan, Al Jazeera.
After ramping up the possibility for weeks of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the White House on Wednesday downgraded that threat from President Vladimir Putin, saying an invasion is no longer imminent.
I used that once. I think others have used that once, and then we stopped using it because I think it sent a message that we weren't intending to send, which was that we knew that President Putin had made a decision.
Still, the United States is sending more troops to Eastern Europe. Some of the forces will be repositioned to Romania. Others will be coming from the United States to Poland and Germany. It's a response to President Putin, who has positioned tens of thousands of troops inside Russia near Ukraine's border.
It's important that we send a strong signal to Mr. Putin and, frankly, to the world that NATO matters to the United States. It matters to our allies. And we have ironclad Article 5 commitments. An attack on one is an attack on all.
The roughly 3,000 troops will bolster the NATO presence in Europe and are in addition to the 8,500 U.S. troops put on standby last month by U.S. President Joe Biden. The United States maintains diplomacy is the best path to resolving security disagreements. Russia wants assurances NATO will halt expansion into former Soviet republics like Ukraine. But the West won't provide that guarantee. Instead, Biden's promised severe consequences if Putin invades.
He has shown no signs of being interested or willing to de-escalate the tensions.
The U.S. forces will reinforce NATO's eastern flank, working with host countries, as NATO has not yet activated its response force to counter what it refers to as Russian aggression.
I think there's a bargaining aspect to what they're doing, which is to put something on the table that can be taken away, a chit, if you will, in exchange for Russian non-aggression against Ukraine.
Despite no new Russian threat and no signs of an imminent invasion of Ukraine, the Pentagon says the movement of troops could begin soon, and there could be the possibility of even more troop movements in the future. Kimberly Helkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
A massive show of force, tanks, artillery, more than 100,000 Russian troops. The U.S. military says this is now a strong enough force to take over the country of Ukraine. On Monday, the UN Security Council will put the issue front and center, with the U.S. ambassador saying she will try to make Russia feel isolated in the world.
Our voices are unified in calling for the Russians to explain themselves. We're going to go in the room prepared to listen to them, but we're not going to be distracted by their propaganda.
And the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. is hoping to rally the international community as well with a warning.
If
Ukraine will be further attacked by Russia, of course they will not stop after Ukraine.
But with Russia able to veto any action at the UN, this is likely to be more theater than a solution. But one prominent U.S. senator has a new suggestion, saying the U.S. can't give in to Russia's demands that Ukraine will not join NATO, but Ukraine can.
But it's his decision to make. If he decides that the future membership, if there's to be one in NATO for Ukraine, and the question of Russian occupation of Ukraine are two things to put on the table, I think we may move toward a solution to this.
This week, the U.S. Senate is expected to take up a bill that would spell out severe consequences if Russia acts.
Which would include sanctions, which would include more military assistance, which would include helping them to fight back against the cyber attacks that the Russians continue to use against Ukraine, and also to help on the disinformation campaign that Russia is actively involved in to try to destabilize the Zelensky government.
But the Biden administration wants to hold off on sanctions as a deterrent, hoping that the threat of freezing Russia out of the international banking system is enough to stop any military action, which Russia says it has no intention of taking. In Kiev on Sunday, a show of gratitude. Ukrainians take to the streets to send a message that they appreciate the support, even as many hope they won't need it. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
This is the Amur natural gas installation in central Russia, one of many such plants whose product is piped to destinations in Asia and Europe, all of which generates an export revenue of more than $200 million a day for the provider Gazprom. The greatest single market is Germany, closely followed by other European countries. Cumulatively, 128 billion cubic meters of gas flows to the EU each year, representing around a third of its annual imports. But what would happen if the Ukraine crisis became a war and all of this was suddenly switched off?
There could be an interruption of gas supplies. However, the Russian government should weigh carefully whether they really want that. While it's possible to put Europe under pressure, Europe would eventually turn to liquid gas from other countries.
If liquid gas or LNG is a solution, there are a few obvious potential suppliers, most notably the US and the state of Qatar. While neither could fill the shortfall of so much gas immediately, one analyst told me Qatar might be able to provide a more medium and long-term solution.
The Qataris indeed did supply Europe with a lot more gas in the past, but given the fact that the Europeans were not very fond of the way that the contracts were structured, Qatar pivoted to Asia and now supplies for most of the gas to them rather than the Europeans. Should there be some, say, reconsideration on the European end when it comes to the contractual elements and their compatibility with European energy law, then this might actually change the situation, at least in the medium to long term.
From the geopolitical perspective, there are increasingly loud voices in Western Europe who don't want to be so dependent on Russia for their energy supply.
We have to build the foundations of our sovereignty, which means more independence from Russia. When I look at our imports in terms of oil and gas, we are not independent from Russia. This won't happen overnight.
EU leaders have been clear that a Russian act of aggression against Ukraine would have dire consequences for President Putin and his country. It would mean an end to his hopes of switching on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, depriving him of tens of billions of dollars in revenue and depriving the EU of hundreds of billions of cubic meters of Russian gas. The view in Berlin is that such a price is worth paying if it can deter Moscow from invasion. Ministers here don't want to arm the Ukrainians. They believe their most potent weapon against Putin is sanctions, no matter the cost. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera, in the German capital.
The latest images released by North Korea are striking. On Sunday, it test-fired an intermediate-range ballistic missile, the Hwasong-12, that is nuclear capable. It reached a height of 2,000 kilometers, taking pictures of the Korean peninsula along the way. But it has a range of 4,500 kilometers, far enough to reach the U.S. territory of Guam. But it's not the most powerful ballistic missile in Kim Jong-un's arsenal. In 2017, North Korea tested the Hwasong-14 and 15, the latter of which could, in theory, reach the continental United States. And in 2020, it showed off an even larger ICBM, which hasn't been tested yet.
North Korea has spent a lot of time and investment in the past 2 or 3 years, certainly during COVID, in developing some of its missile capabilities. And that is aligned very closely with a 5-year weapons plan that North Korea announced at the beginning of 2021, with the aim to develop capabilities that will enable North Korea to fight a modern conflict.
The U.S. wants direct talks with North Korea.
We've offered this over and over to the DPRK, and they've not accepted it.
So the question is, what's Kim Jong-un's game plan?
The North Koreans aren't actually really putting forward much right now, right? I mean, they have to actually show up in order to strike a deal with the Biden people. And so I'm kind of surprised with the pace of the test, because my sense is that the Biden people are willing to talk if the North Koreans will show up.
It was North Korea's 7th missile test in January, a new record. Its self-imposed moratorium on missile tests appears well and truly at an end. Andrew Chappell, Al Jazeera.
We're going to begin with breaking news out of the U.S., where President Joe Biden's announced the killing of Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi, the leader of ISIL, by American special forces in Syria. In a statement, Joe Biden says, "Last night, at my direction, U.S. military forces in the northwest of Syria successfully undertook a counter-terrorism operation to protect the American people and our allies and make the world a safer place. Thanks to the skill and bravery of our armed forces, we have taken off the battlefield Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi, the leader of ISIS. All Americans have returned safely from the operation." Well, Sinem Kosioglu is standing by in Istanbul. First, let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, the White House obviously very pleased with this operation, but there are going to be some questions to be asked.
Yeah, the White House characterizing this as a successful operation, and notable in the president's statement that he released is that all of the U.S. special forces that were involved in this operation returned back safely. But the same cannot be said for the civilians on the ground. We know that there are at least more than a dozen casualties, and among them children. And so that is of grave concern to many who have been watching this, waking up to this news in the United States, given the fact that this is a bit of a surprise on a number of counts. Not only the fact that there are still U.S. operations in Syria, which many will be unfamiliar with, but also the fact that the United States was not more careful, more surgical in this operation and allowing it to be more precise and preventing these civilian deaths. So this is something that the U.S. military will have to explain, but it's also something that the U.S. president will have to explain why he's continued this Trump-era policy. Donald Trump, his predecessor, saying that most of the U.S. troops were out of Syria, but as the commander-in-chief, Joe Biden, obviously carrying on some of those policies, keeping those troops in place, even if in a very small number. He'll have to explain why that is, why he decided to take out the ISIL leader now, and at the same time risk innocent lives.
Anger on the streets of Peru's capital, Lima. Protesters are demanding that Spanish oil giant Repsol lose its operating license after nearly 12,000 barrels of crude oil leaked into the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of Lima.
We are outraged by the pollution, and we're going to continue the nationwide fight. That's why I'm here. I want Repsol to leave, for all transnational companies which have only come here to steal from us to go away.
The spill happened while a tanker was offloading crude oil to a refinery. Repsol says the pipeline was damaged by the tsunami triggered by the recent volcanic eruption near Tonga. But government officials say the ship's captain doubts that, and protesters accuse Repsol of spreading misinformation.
Just like thousands of other citizens, we've come to protest against pollution and against the lies Repsol is peddling. It systematically said that the damage was minimal, then said it was as a result of the tsunami. Then it told us the incorrect quantity of oil spilled.
The Environment Minister has banned Repsol from unloading oil until further notice. He also wants guarantees the company is properly maintaining its oil pipelines.
First, we call for a halt to all hydrocarbon loading and unloading activities in the Peruvian Sea by Repsol until it provides us with technical guarantees that no further damage will be done to the sea that belongs to all Peruvians.
Repsol says the decision is disproportionate and unreasonable. It says it's hired more than 2,000 people, including local fishermen, to clean up the polluted beaches. But many Peruvians won't be satisfied until the government orders Repsol to leave. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
Workers are busy reconstructing the Hector Martinez building in the center of Saravena. Last month, a car bomb exploded, destroying much of this block. Dissidents of former FARC rebels are being blamed for the attack, which killed one person. The buildings house human rights groups, social organizations and unions.
We were holding a security meeting because of the way the conflict was evolving, with direct attacks against social organizations and community leaders. The FARC dissidents are accusing us of sympathizing with the ELN, and that's how they justified attacking us.
Arauca, an oil-rich region on the border with Venezuela, has been mostly calm since the signing of a peace deal between the government and FARC rebels in 2016. But violence returned as FARC dissident groups began to fight ELN rebels for control of drug trafficking and contraband routes. Since the beginning of the year, more than 60 people have been killed, others kidnapped or forcibly displaced. Rocio Delgado, sister of security guard Simeon Delgado, killed in the explosion, says locals are terrified.
This war is absurd, and my brother is just one of many victims. Everybody is anxious because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Even on a quiet day, people can't sleep, can't rest well. They fear leaving their house. Everything has been affected.
Normally at 6:30 p.m., the streets of the center of Saravena would be alive with people shopping. But since the conflict started, shops are closing early and people are hurrying home, fearing another possible attack. And on top of that, the mayor has imposed a curfew every night starting at 9 p.m. The government has increased its military presence in the area. The violence has pushed more than a dozen health workers to quit after hospitals were also threatened by the groups. Catholic priest Albert Giraldo is holding healing sessions to help workers deal with trauma. He says part of the problem is that the military is mainly protecting the oil infrastructure in a region long neglected by the government.
It's a problem that goes back in history. The government has always prioritized protecting military infrastructure instead of the people. The church has asked the president to reopen the door to a peace dialogue with the ELN. There was supposed to be a meeting in Stockholm. The government didn't go. We are also trying to talk to then dissidents, but we are on our own.
While hundreds have left, others like Sonia Lopez promise to rebuild and continue their work for the people, even if it might cost them their life. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Saravena. Farmer and congressional candidate Giovanni Guerrero has lived the horror of Colombia's conflict firsthand. A local victims leader, he's running for office for a special electoral district for peace created to give a voice to underrepresented people like him. But the return of violent confrontation between armed groups in Arauca has made campaigning impossible.
We are just sitting still, trying to work in the village, talking to friends, knocking on doors when possible.
More than 60 people have been killed since the beginning of the year in a conflict between ELN rebels and dissident groups of former FARC rebels. We had planned to follow Giovanni handing out flyers and visiting a prospective voter, but as we were leaving, he had a change of heart.
I don't think we should. It would be a nice thing for me to take you around town and be on the news, telling people what my plan is, what I want to do if I win. But right now, it would put us at risk.
The little campaigning that is happening is limited to the main urban center. That's because all candidates are saying it's just too dangerous to travel to rural areas, even on main roads like this one, because the armed groups are known to set up checkpoints at any time. The situation is also affecting regular candidates. Older Cáceres, who is running for a traditional seat in the House of Representatives, has campaigned in Arauca for years.
We are putting our lives in the crossfire to campaign, and we accept silencing ourselves and confinement to try to sustain democracy.
He says the situation is as bad as at the height of the conflict. He's running most of his campaign on social media.
Organizing a meeting in Fortul is impossible. Going to the town of La Esmeralda, where I was a teacher, and getting 40, 50 people together, also impossible.
The local human rights official says political and social leaders have become the main targets of the armed groups.
On paper, everything is great. The government is fulfilling its obligation to the victims who can vote in these elections. But the reality on the ground is the opposite, and people can't exercise their rights.
Running a political campaign in a conflict-ridden region like Arauca was never easy, but this time was supposed to be different. Instead, threats and attacks are once again silencing these already marginalized voices. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Arauca.